Hi, welcome to another round of Useful Hour. I decided that we would give this week of Useful Hour over to the topic of server hardware because obviously our division has received a huge pile of it. There's a set of handouts going around that has a list of all the different chassis that we got. The number was around 200 in total that we received, 200 boxes. If you look at the breakdown, you can see that they're most heavily clustered in the PowerEdge 2950, PowerEdge 2850, 2650, and 1950 series, but we have a pile of other computers as well. So what I wanted to do today is try to explain some background on what it means to be a server computer. So I'm sitting with three of them here. If you want to move around with the camera, that might actually be helpful today. We're talking about a 1U model, a 2U model, and over there we have a 5U model. So these are all PowerEdge machines.
Is U unit?
Yes, it's just the number of units tall. It's a standard size of height. I believe it's something like 2 1/4 inches per unit. So we have racks out in the hallway. Those are 42 units tall. And these 1U boxes are a single unit tall. So you can put 42 of these in if you were to fill every bay in them with one of these. So server hardware is generally designed to be relatively easy to break into. So when we look inside one of these, we're going to see a pretty, this is, as I said, a 1U machine. We're going to get a pretty sparing arrangement of parts. You can see that they've got these nice blue latches here. These are to tell you how you can pull out, for example, the muffin fans here. The enemy of all computing is, of course, heat. And so having the ability to deal well with heat in a confined space is a very large part of what makes computing go or not go. So behind things like these little doors here, these little blue tabs are supposed to tell me where to pull. Yeah, maybe I'm not going to get it done today. I don't know. We'll see. Well, it doesn't matter. Well, some of the others are a little easier to pull into. We have memory sitting here. We have CPUs back underneath heat sinks in here. So these fans are designed to push air through the case, through the CPUs to blow the heat off of the heat sinks. So in effect, you have a sandwich. You have the CPU itself generating a huge amount of heat. That heat is passed through thermal paste into a heat sink. That heat sink has vanes on it, and those vanes draw the heat away from the CPU core so that it can be blown out. So the vanes on these heat sinks is mostly designed to provide a lot of surface area for this rushing air to blow the heat away from the CPU. Oh, I wasn't doing it. Yeah, so let's see if we can see. That is the poke. It's not being very cooperative. Those are for the risers. I don't know. We can lift it out on the 2U case. So here's that was the 1U machine we were looking at. Yeah, it's being a little squirrely. All right. Pull a little latch, and then this door comes off. And now we can look at a 2U case here. We again have our little fans here. We've got some duct work covering this part. This one's a little easier to deal with. So it's on a little gate. You want to pull the camera around? So we have CPUs underneath the heatsink and fan units. The fans are blowing that air out. And then we have memory sockets right here to work with. So we have a total of 8 places we can plug RAM in. We have a total of 2 physical processors. We have some cards, etc. And you can see that things like the chipsets have their own heatsink and fan units on, or heat sinks associated with them as well. So
what's this, the CPU?
That is the heatsink associated with the CPU. Yeah,
like radiators almost.
Exactly.
Surface area.
That's exactly what they're intended for. Yeah. So 2 CPUs there, 2 physical CPUs there, and then finally we have a 5U machine over here. And it's obviously a pretty big construction inside. If you look at the CPUs from the back side, you'll see the vanes on the heat sinks right there. We have other fans covering the memory units and so on, and plus we have some cards. Okay, so basically the taller the unit, the more you can pack it out. So when we look at something like a 1U machine over here, we're looking at high-density computing. This machine in particular has 8 processor cores, so 2 CPUs, each with 4 cores. So in effect, 8 processors that we can work with. The machine over here has a pair of double core machines. So this is just 4 processor cores in this case. And then over here, we have 2 machines, 2 CPUs that are each dual core, I believe. So even though these machines are larger, they're not actually faster at computing. The fastest machine here is the small one, the 1U machine, which is one of the reasons why I reemphasize that heat is the enemy of computing. We are always in this running battle on server hardware to get the heat away from the CPUs faster than the processor is generating it.
Don't they make water-cooled ones now?
It is possible to do liquid-cooled systems as well. You can do that with a gaming PC, for that matter. Or Peltier coolers. That's a way to use electrical current to separate temperatures. So there are lots of different methods that you can use for this. Water cooling is just one of the routes that you can use. Personally, I feel a little uncomfortable to try to have liquids close to electricity, but I'm a paranoid.
Is that, you don't want the radiator to burst.
Right. Now I'm going to go ahead and start up one of these, if I can get that seated correctly. There we go. All right.
So can I just,
oh yes, please.
So the motherboard
Yes.
is all this.
Yes, the motherboard is the flat piece at the bottom. These machines are a little unusual for having risers in them that rise up from those motherboards, and they have the card slots in them. So again, that's not something that you see very frequently in a PC, but in server hardware, that's more frequently the case.
So you can change RAM, even the processor, and
yes.
It'll keep the MAC address, the original.
Right, the MAC address is the physical address associated with the network hardware. So in this case, we have 2 network ports that are integrated into the motherboard, and those 2 ports are physically connected. So those are always going to have the same physical addresses, the same MAC addresses. If you add in another card for networking, it will be associated with its own MAC address.
Okay.
So in this case, we see that this machine has on the motherboard 2 gigabit Ethernet ports, and they've added a third via this PCI Express card. So I'm not sure if this is, I think it's just 100 gig, 10, 100, 1000. I think it's just a standard gigabit Ethernet port, actually. So in effect, this machine has 3 different gigabit ports.
So in terms of, I was just thinking with, say, Windows, like that, what can you do on your computer without losing your license for Windows? Say, where would that be stored?
The license for Windows?
Yeah, if you've bought a legitimate
Yeah.
Windows and you want to replace your CPU, or I know RAM doesn't have enough RAM,
I see.
and that it still recognizes that this computer has.
Right. So Microsoft has a database of different different numbers that are licensed to use the system. If you decommission an old computer and build a new one and just try to reuse that Windows license, you won't be able to do so because it will recognize that the hardware is very different. But the hardware signature is not limited to just the CPU or just a card. If I don't remember what it is, it may be associated with the motherboard for that matter. But if you change your computer enough, Microsoft will no longer allow you to use that license of Windows on that machine.
Okay.
But it's not a matter of simply replacing a hard drive. That's not a big enough deal for them to discontinue that license.
Or that wouldn't by default just wake up again. You might have to contact Microsoft, tell them what you've done, and get a pass.
I've had to phone in the past with the amount of modification I've done on the computer, but that's been less and less an issue, especially with their new Windows 10 licensing model, where even any license that you've got for Windows 7, like that 32-bit license you had for Windows 7, you can use that as your license number when you install Windows 10. Even if you're installing the 64-bit and you had a 32-bit 7, it'll still use that as a valid license number. It'll approve your machine for use with Windows 10. So I just had the opportunity to do that the other day. So that's the hardware, but how is it different? How is it different than what we use routinely? So I would like to start with a story from around 1990. So I was computing back then, and maybe some of you were, but some of you weren't. But in 1990, buying a great computer probably meant buying a 486. That would be really exciting to buy a 486. But Intel had marketed two different kinds of 486 at that time. There was the 486DX and the 486SX. And a lot of people were really confused about what the difference between them was. The difference was that the 486DX featured what we call a math coprocessor. So it would enable you to do floating point math very quickly rather than being forced to do floating point math with old school instructions. So if you were doing anything associated with a lot of mathematical computation, you would definitely want the DX and not the SX model. So how did Intel produce two different designs? Did it start with a design of the 486 without the math coprocessor and another version of the 486 that did have the math coprocessor? No, in fact, they had one design that they used, the 486. And yet what they found was that because this was the largest, most complex processor they'd ever tried to engineer, they were producing some number of failed batches of processors that they were manufacturing in their plant. So what they would do is test the CPUs to see what clock speed will they run at, what voltages will they run at, and also, is the math coprocessor viable, or is it dead? So if the math coprocessor had errors in it, they would burn particular bridges on the CPUs and call those and market them as 486 SXs. And the machines that had viable floating point hardware were sold as 486 DXs. That's kind of shocking, isn't it? I mean, I remember the first time that I heard it, I thought to myself, this has got to be just somebody telling a malicious lie about Intel. But in fact, they were selling defective 486 DXs that had been rebadged as 486 SXs to reflect the fact that the math coprocessors were dead. So
they tried to make them all DX, but some failed, and they just called them SX and modified them a little bit.
That is precisely what happened. Later on down the line, they started selling clock doubled or clock tripled 486 models, the DX2s and the DX3 machines, and those would allow them to bin out further, that this processor will run at this CPU with this front side bus at this voltage, therefore we'll sell it as this, that, or the other. Okay, so this process is called processor binning, that we recognize that some part of this CPU might fail, therefore we'll sell it as a lesser unit. Now, I next want to talk a little bit about processor cache. And this is a very important topic because this is one of the principal differences with how a Xeon processor, Xeon, differs from the kind of processor you might use in your computer. So a Xeon processor is distinctive for a couple different reasons. So we would start by saying, if you want to have multiple Intel processors in a single computer, not processor cores, but multiple physical processors in the same machine, then you must buy a Xeon and not an i7. So this was something that happened, a little bit after the year 2000, that Intel decided that in the future, if you were doing multiple physical processors in the same machine, you would have to purchase a Xeon. Before that, you could do things like buy, there was, for example, a motherboard that had two slot 1s in it. For a while, the processors from Intel were sold in these cartridges that plugged into slot 1s. So you could buy two Celerons and plug those in to the two slots of this motherboard and have two processors by purchasing Celerons, which were much, much cheaper. So you can think of, at the time you had the Celeron line and the Pentium line, or the Pentium 2 line, whatever, and then you had the Xeons at the top. So I've tried to put a, let me return to this topic of cache. So one way a Xeon is different than an ordinary computer is that if you're going to have multiple physical CPUs, you have to have Xeons, not others, if you're purchasing from Intel. The next way that they differ is by the type of memory that they take. Most server computers like this do not take the same type of RAM as you would put in your i7 class computer. You know, you're not going to buy a bunch of DDR3 and throw it into these machines. And the reason is that they use a type of sorry, I'm a little out of date on this, but parity checking memory called ECC, error correcting code. That's what it stands for. So the memory that we use in servers is distinct from the memory that we use in our PCs by having this error checking property within it. But the third way that they differ is by cache. So when you have an instruction that requires a bit of information drawn from memory, if you had no cache, the CPU would be forced to communicate via the chipset with the memory bank to retrieve the datum found at this particular address.
Cache is like basically stored memory, is it? Stored.
Well, you're cutting to the chase on it. If you had no cache, you would have to go all the way through that process in order to grab the bit of information from RAM.
Mm-hmm.
Cache is a go-between. So the cache built into a CPU is designed to predict which bit of information you're going to want from memory and retrieve it in advance of you're actually needing it. So that is a clever bit of code, a clever bit of hardware that has to be operating in order for you to get maximum throughput of data processing.
Web browsers have that cache?
That is different. So in a web browser, the cache is used to remember things that you've previously downloaded from the web. So things that have moved through the network to your computer. So the cache there is acting as a quick lookup table for things that you might want to return to that you've seen in the past. In this case, we have not only the ability to see bits of data that you've been working on recently with your program, but also looking ahead, forecasting which bits you might want to get from memory next.
Okay.
So let's say that you are watching a movie off your hard drive. Well, that's a bad example. Let's say you're watching a movie on a RAM drive. That's probably more parallel to this. In this case, we watch these bytes are used to create this image off of the file, and you're progressively working your way through this file in a serial order. So that's a very straightforward prediction. Having seen this set of bytes on your screen, you're probably going to go to the adjoining set of bytes for the next frame, and the next set of bytes, and the next set of bytes. So in that case, projecting which bits of information are of interest to you is very straightforward. With the code that we typically use, you may have some loop structures that you use that increment a counter every time they pass through that loop. So if the processor is able to keep in cache this variable representing the loop counter, it doesn't have to go back out to main memory every time it wants to increment it by 1. So that's the processor cache value. Now, all CPUs that you purchase today, probably down to the ones in your cell phone, use cache. The amount of cache that they have, though, is variable. So one of the ways that we see that the cache for a Xeon processor differs from a Pentium 4, for that matter, is that the cache sizes are larger. The next is that there are multiple layers of cache to work with. So anytime your software is trying to work with some variable, it's ideal if that variable is already stored in a register. That would be the very fastest type. That's not a cache, that's the memory of the CPU core itself. But if it's not there, ideally it would have to go to level 1 cache, which is the highest speed variety of cache memory available to the CPU core. This cache level 1 is very, very fast, and there's not a huge amount of it. So that's part of the cost of making it so fast. So the computer failing to find the datum that it wants in cache 1 will go to the cache level 2 in order to try to grab it out. And cache level 2 is a little slower on the retrieval than cache 1, but there's even more of it than there was of the level 1 cache. So in a normal i7, you probably have just level 1 and level 2 cache, and that's it. If the CPU core needs some information and it's not in level 1 or level 2 cache, it's got to go all the way to main memory. Xeons are different in that the CPUs have a third layer of cache that's even more monstrous. And so you might find that there's a price difference between two Xeon processors that run at the same speed. And that might confuse you, But then if you look more closely, you might see that the cache size, that the level 3 cache size is different on one than on the other. Okay. Now, I've put a very brief history of computing on these spreadsheets that you should have. And I wanted to walk you through a little bit of it. It's in the middle section. So if we start back in 2001, we are in a phase called net burst. Net burst. So the net burst is principally known to us for bringing us the Pentium 4. Does everyone remember the Pentium 4?
No.
You don't remember the Pentium 4?
I never really paid much attention to it.
Oh, okay. Well, the Pentium 4...
I remember 2.
Okay. Oh, well, long past, yeah. So Pentium 2 followed by the Pentium 3, which was kind of a gaming variant of the Pentium 2, more or less. The Pentium 2 itself was kind of a variant of the Pentium Pro. And then finally the Pentium 4 came. Now the Pentium 4 was a huge step away from the Pentium 3. It was very, very different on a lot of scores than was the Pentium 3. It was an altogether new architecture called net burst. And net burst, in some respects, was a fairly cynical ploy by the microprocessor industry. They learned that people had grown accustomed to spending more on a processor if it was clocked higher, is what they would say. If it had a higher operating frequency than another processor. If you're given a 3 gigahertz processor or a 2.5 gigahertz processor, which one rocks more? The 3, everyone thinks. So what does that frequency actually represent? Ah, okay, well good. So first off, it's 3 what?
Gigahertz.
Gigahertz, very good. Okay, so the unit we're talking about is the Hertz, H-E-R-T-Z, named after a famous German. Can't remember his first name. But the Hertz is a measure of frequency. It is the number of times per second that something happens. So in a CPU, we ask how frequently does this machine process new instructions? So if you purchase a 3 gigahertz processor, every 3 billionth of a second, it's ready to take on a new instruction. Kind of shocking, isn't it? Now, some of those instructions are long and complex to do. Things like, say, multiplying a vector of numbers by another vector of numbers, right? Something like that would be a very complex instruction. So what is the simplest instruction that you could possibly give a CPU?
Keyboard input.
Nope, that's actually very complex. The simplest option that any processor can do is sometimes called the NOP. No operation. It's true. This is a real instruction in a lot of processor instruction sets. So if you use if your program consists of 15 million no operation commands, you can time how long that will take to run through the CPU by just dividing by the clock rate. So we use CISC computers in almost every case, and these CISC computers, complex instruction set computers, differ from RISC computers, reduced instruction set computers, by the fact that there's a diversity in how many clock cycles it takes to run a particular instruction. So with NetBurst, Intel's goal was produce processors that can run at incredibly high clock speeds. And that's what the NetBurst architecture was all about. So back in 2001, they produced those. Now the problem was, you could have a computer running at 1.5 gigahertz and another computer running at 2 gigahertz from different manufacturers, and the 1.5 gigahertz machine would wipe the floor with a 2 gigahertz Pentium 4. This is because of something called a cache miss. That the Pentium 4 was really great at running lots and lots of instructions in close succession, so long as the information they needed was already located in the cache. So anytime it went to cache and couldn't find the information it wanted and had to go out to main memory, the CPU would just sit around twiddling its thumbs waiting for memory to come forward with the information. So NetBurst CPUs could be sold at extremely high clock rates, and people thought, I'm getting a great computer, it runs at 2.5 gigahertz, and yet they weren't that great at performance in complex code with a lot of branching to it. So NetBurst was a little frustrating on that score. So I'm not going to go into that much detail on the other architectures here, but let's start by saying NetBurst was first introduced in May of 2001. So we're at least in this millennium, right? And I've written here a feature size. You see there's a feature size starting at 180 and another feature size at 65. This refers to the number of nanometers that each transistor within the processor was, the size of it in the process that they were using to build these processors. So the very first Pentium 4s used 180 nanometer transistors and thus were prone to producing a lot of heat. When they had reduced the feature size to 65, if you had just produced the same initial processor that you'd made at 180, the amount of silicon you would use would be a lot smaller, so you could put more dies on the wafer. So by being able to make smaller transistors, you increase the amount of profit you get off of each wafer of silicon that goes through your process. Okay, so that was 2001, and you can see that the maximum number of cores in each processor for the Pentium 4 was 2. You may have heard of a Pentium D series Pentium 4. That is a double core Pentium 4. But most of the Pentium 4s that were sold were single core. Now the core architecture that came next was introduced in 2006. So think of that as the 5-year desert, right? For 5 years we had just Pentium 4s, from Intel anyway, for doing amazing work. This is, incidentally, the time when AMD had its heyday, really. AMD introduced 64-bit processors during this interval, and people got sick of buying Pentium 4s when they could buy a 64-bit processor from AMD. But Intel fought back in 2006. You see that using their 65, is it 65 micron or nanometer? I'm drawing blank. I'm sorry, I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. So using their 65, I'm thinking it's micron. It couldn't be, that's huge. Well, anyway, using the 65 process, Intel created this core technology, which was their first effort to come out after NetBurst. They basically fell back all the way to the Pentium M laptop processor, using that as the basis for what core was going to look like. Racked up the clock speed, added improved caches, predictive algorithms, etc., and core was their product. So at first, the core processors were just 32-bit, but later on they produced the Core 2 subvariant of the core processor. Those were 64-bit, and you could have up to 4 processor cores on one CPU. Now, that term is important in the context of this new hardware that has arrived. I was eventually going to come back to talk about Xeon processors, right? And the thing that I need to point out here is that alongside each of these consumer processors, the Pentium 4, the Core 2 Quad, the Core 2 Duo, the Core i7, with each of these new generations of consumer processors, we have a corresponding Xeon processor. And again, this Xeon primarily differs. It's using the same core logic as these CPUs are, but instead it's gaining the ability to have multiple CPUs on one motherboard and to have the ability to deal with error-correcting memory and to have a level 3 cache. So when you see the release of the new i7, that means there's also a new Xeon available to us. So from the period of 2006 to 2009, the Core 2 architecture was kind of the best thing that Intel had to offer. Almost all of the hardware that we have received from MWeb uses this Core 2 architecture as its basis for those Xeon processors. Okay? So when you see something like this, this is a Core 2 Quad, except in the Xeon variant. It has the level 3 cache, and it's got the ability to have multiple processors on the motherboard. These are dual core, so these are like Core 2 Duos with level 3 cache added on and the ability to have multiple processors on there. And these two are almost indistinguishable. So I have written to the right the 1U, 2U, and 5U examples that we're working with. The 1U is using 2 quad-core, 2 GHz Xeon E5405 CPUs. So the E5405, I believe, is one of the later variants of the Core 2 Quad series. So we have a total of 8 physical cores, and they pretend like they're actually 16 in this machine. So it has 8 physical cores that masquerade as 16 processors. Okay. Right. Now there are, obviously if you were buying a new computer today, you wouldn't purchase yourself a Core 2 quad. That would be zany because that's really, really old. These days, if you were buying a high-performance individual PC, you would buy an i7. So i7 was first introduced as the Nehalem technology. All these others that I've listed here, Nehalem, Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Haswell, Broadwell, and Skylake, these are all different technologies that have all been sold as i7.
And what about the 3 and 5, i3 and 5?
The what?
i3 and 5.
Oh, i3 and i5, right. So those are, you can think of those as different bins, essentially, of the i7. So i3s are limited to 2 cores. I've not seen any i3s that are sold in a 4-core variant. The i5s are kind of like i7s at lower clock speeds, more or less. There's a, I'm trying to remember what their trademark name is for it, but essentially an i7 is designed to run at the fastest clock speed it can without exceeding a certain critical temperature. i5s have the ability to burst in speed a little bit, but they're capped at a lower clock speed max, and there are some limits on what they can do.
So they're basically just not as sophisticated.
Right. Yeah, they're i7s that are dumbed down in various ways.
Because they're still making the 3, 5, and 7, aren't they?
Oh, sure, yes. Yes, the i9 has recently been announced with, I think, Katy Lake series. I think that's what follows on these. But one of the things I want you to notice about that spreadsheet is that the feature size keeps dropping. We were at 180 microns or nanometers, I should know the difference, at the time of NetBurst. By the time NetBurst was over in 2006, they were making it 65 microns. By the time Core 2 Quad was done, 45 microns was the standard. 32 became the standard through Sandy Bridge, and then Sandy Bridge was basically the same processors they'd sold as Sandy Bridge were sold at a shrunk size to create Ivy Bridge, and those are produced at 22 nanometers. Now we're down to 14 nanometers. So with each stage, the number of transistors we can pack into a processor increases because we're able to make the features so small. And the other thing I want you to note is that the number of cores is rising. Back in the days of NetBurst, with the Pentium 4, you could get only 2 cores in a processor. That number rose to 4 with the Core 2 Quads, as we see here. And by the time we were in Nehalem and Sandy Bridge, having around 10 cores became possible. 8 cores was the max with Sandy Bridge, but by the time Ivy Bridge came out, 15 cores was possible. And I'm going to tell you a suspicion. You almost always find that the number of cores available in a CPU rises as a power of 2. So when I see that there were 15 cores in the best Ivy Bridge processor you can buy, my suspicion is that there were actually 16 on the die, and they just assumed that one of those was going to be a failed process, so they deactivated that one and sold it as a 15 part. That would be my guess, given their history. That may be wrong, but it's possible.
And this is all Intel stuff, is it?
This is all Intel, yeah. What AMD's been up to, what Sun and all these other companies, what ARM has been up to, they're all doing their own thing. But all processor manufacturers are always trying to reduce the feature size of their transistors because it increases the number of transistors they can put in a CPU at a given price. All CPU manufacturers, even down to the ones that run our cell phones, are trying to increase the number of cores available. So it's quite frequently the case that you'll find quad-core CPUs running your cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a change from 2001.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so the specific hardware that we've been looking at with our 1U, 2U, and 5U computers shown at the right, these CPUs were the slowest, I believe, at 2 gigahertz. These were fastest, per core anyway, at 2.33 gigahertz. These are Xeon 5140s. And those are higher at, I actually didn't know what the CPUs were on the 5U, but it's obviously a little harder to move around. So if I could ask you to zoom in on the back of this computer for just a moment. I want to point out that we have a pair of power supplies on this thing. So this feature of redundancy is one that we frequently find in these computers, in server hardware. So this machine was designed with 2 separate power supplies because if one of them fails, you want to be able to replace it. And you can leave your machine running. These are hot swappable equipment, so you can pull this out while the machine is running and plug in another one to replace it. Kind of a shocking feature, isn't it?
So there's two, but only one is in use, or runs off one?
Yes, this machine, for example, that I have plugged in here is running off of a single power supply because I didn't plug in the other one.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things I would note here is that this machine, which is designed to be maybe a heavy file server, it's got all this space for hard drives in here after all, has the biggest power supplies. These are 930 watt power supplies. So a whole kilowatt of power for a computer is fairly rare. The machine that has the most CPU cores down here has the least room inside for adding, for example, spinning hard drives. So that machine had 930 watt, this machine had 750 watt power supplies, this one is down at just 670 watts.
And what's a laptop, for example?
10? Well, I'm sorry, the CPU consumes 10. Once you add on powering the screen and the hard drives and stuff like that, it gets a little higher. But they're much lower, much lower. There's not a lot of wattage consumed by a laptop by comparison.
No.
Okay, so that's talking our way through a fair amount of stuff. I also want to note that these machines are different in that they are anticipating that you're going to do something special with your hard drives. Okay, so if I have a computer, say a laptop or something like that, or even a desktop, it's likely that I'm booting off of the same drive that I use for everything. So I might have a single SSD in the computer and that's all the hard drive I use. Or I might be fancy and boot off of a solid state drive and keep another hard drive as my data drive. Something like that would be feasible. Now, in these computers, we have a provision for something called RAID, which is the redundant array of inexpensive disks. So I've put in a little sub on our spreadsheet here to show us that. These machines have, as I said, specialized hardware designed to, it's actually easier to see in this guy, I think, have specialized hardware designed explicitly to handle running the hard drives. So this is a hardware RAID controller. Most motherboards can fake it. They can fake that they have RAID. If you have multiple hard drives plugged directly into the main board, these machines have specialized hardware for that purpose. So one of the things that we see, for example, is that this machine has this card has a battery attached to it. This battery is intended to save your hard drive when the power goes out. If you lose power to the computer, you still have some bits of information that you need to write to your drives. And this battery gives the RAID controller enough juice to keep the drive spinning for just those few seconds longer so it can write all the data from its cache to the drives and shut them down. Okay? So this is...
What sort of time are you talking, like 30 seconds?
I actually don't know off the top of my head. But it doesn't take a long time to shut down drives and clear cache generally. So this, one of the things that you'd want to have a separate card for RAID is to support parity calculation, because frequently the way we combine multiple hard drives together benefits from being able to do checking of whether this information is right or not. That way, if one of the drives fails, you're able to reconstruct all of the content because the information's been written to them redundantly. So what we have then are these big connectors that split out to multiple drive connectors in this back plane. And you have a bunch of hard drives. Sorry, this is going to be a little dark for production here, but these are all hard drives up front. So you see these 8 hard drives can be combined by this drive controller to act like one big hard drive. All right, now there are several ways that we do this. So I created that little spreadsheet. Let's we can scoot back out to talk it through what those are. So, great camera work, sir. All right, so the first of these is called RAID 0. Now I put a colloquial name in there because I always lose track of which one is 0 and which one is 1. So 0 is called striping. So if I have, in this computer, for example, 2 hard drives, right here and here, these drives are tiny. These are, these are 146 gigabytes apiece. These, but they're server drives. They're 15,000 RPM drives. So a spinning hard drive in your laptop might be spinning at 5,400 RPM. These are spinning 3 times as quickly, which increases the rate at which data can be written and read. Okay, so I want these 2 drives to act like one big hard drive instead. These are called drive rails. These rails allow you to move hard drives in and out much more rapidly.
So where is the operating systems stored on the hard drives there?
At the moment it's stored on those hard drives.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so I've got these set up on this computer in a stripe. So this RAID 0 means that a bit of a file that I write to my drive gets split up. So half of the file ends up on this hard drive, half of the file ends up on the other hard drive. Okay, so that means that I can write a file twice as fast as I would be able to if I were writing it to one drive, because each drive has to write only half of the file. And reading the file can happen twice as fast as if I had just one of these drives.
But that means if one drive breaks, you lose everything.
Exactly. And that's why people always shudder a little bit when you say you're running a RAID 0. Because the RAID 0 dies, you lose all of the information if either drive dies. So that's pretty uncomfortable. But it is fast. So there's that. All right. All right. So RAID 1 is the option for safety. Now I said each of these was 146 gigs. So if I treat this as a RAID 1, my RAID capacity is still 146 gigs. But if either drive dies, I have all of my data stored securely on the other one. So it's completely protected if you have a single drive failure. Now, you will see some people combining that. Let's say I have 4 hard drives. 1, 2, 3, well, sorry, this one has 1, 2, 3 in it. That's not a great scenario. But if I had 4 hard drives of that sort in here, I could treat this as 2 stripes for which I have a mirror. I still write twice as quickly and read twice as quickly. But if any of those 4 drives die, or if two drives in one stripe die, I still have all the information in the other stripe. So that's called striping and mirroring, because you have the ability to combine information from those 4 drives.
But then I guess you're reducing your memory by half, aren't you? What you can store by half.
Yes, that's still true. Now a machine like that can take a whole load of drives, if you can have, say, 5 drives, that's the typical way we see it, you might make a RAID level 5. The RAIDs level 2, 3, and 4 are not frequently used. So for RAID 5, we would have the ability to do something called striping and parity. So essentially you treat the 5 drives as one drive, and so your capacity grows, but you're writing the data with a parity bit. So you're writing a little bit more information than you would if you were doing it in just a stripe. And that extra bit means that if any one of those 5 drives die, you can replace it with a fresh drive and recreate the information that was on it, starting from the 4 drives that are remaining. So it has some of the throughput benefits of the stripe, but it still has fault tolerance, meaning you can survive the loss of one drive. What happens if you lose 2 drives in a RAID 5, though? You're SOL. No luck for you.
So these are, I guess, you're talking, it's like instantaneous backups all the time that you have.
Yes.
Right, as opposed to you might work on your laptop and back up once a week or something, but this is a constant, always.
Exactly.
Because it's presumably very important information.
Yes. So I run a group server, file server called Deep Thought. And Deep Thought has a RAID 5 in it using 4 hard drives, 5 I forget. And so if one of those drives fails, I'll still be able to recreate all the data that's on there so long as I replace that one. Mm-hmm. In a RAID 5, if 2 of your drives die though, you lose everything. So RAID 6 writes a little bit more redundant information, chops into your space a little bit more, and even if you lose 2 drives from the set, you're still going to be able to reconstruct all the information on them. So RAID stripes, RAID mirrors, and then stripe plus parity, that's this RAID 5 and RAID 6 stuff, those are good to know about. Now I want to point out that the hardware these machines are using to conduct RAID on servers are just PCI Express cards, which means you can run them in any desktop you've got. We now have a couple hundred of these RAID cards for anyone who wants to mess with them. So that is a pretty good advantage for us.
Guys, what? It's a CPU that's generating the heat in the computer, is it?
Mostly. The memory produces a fair bit.
The RAM?
Yeah.
Okay.
The chipset.
Just because it's not moving parts, is it? Is it just
No, those are all just
current flowing through the
yeah, resistance in the electronics. They've got a lot of transistors going there.
Yeah.
All right. So there are some other things we could talk about: multi-threading, message passing, and Beowulf high-speed networks. I'm going to talk about those in brief. So the Beowulf Cluster is one of the first ways that people sought to build high-throughput computing. So if you're being sloppy about it, you can just get a whole bunch of desktop computers and find a way to distribute your computing problem so that each of those computers can solve a part of it. So that's called a Beowulf cluster. These machines are not, strictly speaking, Beowulf in that they're not little desktop computers that were intended to be used separately. These quite clearly have a very server-oriented case. They're exactly the same width, and they have these rails built into them. Those rails are intended to fit them into a rack. So these are rack servers. But you will see, for example, the i7 computers that I brought with me from Vanderbilt University. Those have now been set up as a Beowulf cluster on which we're doing microbial assemblies. Those are i7s, which mean they have just one physical core, one physical processor in them, but they're quad core. So this machine has 8 cores by comparison, but they're slower cores. So using a bunch of machines like this, you could achieve better throughput than what we can with my little collection of i7s, simply because I don't have very many of them. And we have oodles of these. So if we look at just the 1950s, that's this type of computer, we had 19 of them. 19 of those will probably be faster than the 5 or so of my i5s that I can muster into life right now. Or we could go with the 51 2950s, this kind, and of course have 100 CPU cores to work with. So we have quite a few to work with. Multi-threading is the term that we use to describe when a single computing job has been split up into multiple threads for running on a single computer. So this computer can handle 8 threads simultaneously, and it'll act like it can handle 16 threads simultaneously. So if you have a single computer job where all of those threads need to be accessing exactly the same data structures, you can run it on here very, very happily. But that's not, multi-threading does not allow us to spread a job beyond the bounds of one computer with shared memory. So message passing is a method that has been that's been built up in libraries like MPICH2, that allows us to coordinate computing across multiple computers at the same time. So MPICH is what we used in the context of mirror match when we were trying to distribute the identification of peptides to tandem mass spectra to spread that over potentially hundreds of different computers. So message passing and multi-threading differ on that score. There is frequently a problem, though, that when we do this distribution of a big computing job across lots of computers, that we want to have the ability to share information among them at a higher speed than what we can do with just gigabit Ethernet. So for that, we've developed things like MirrorNet and other high-speed networking technologies that allow us to move information back and forth. And I would point out on our spreadsheets that there's some appliances called silkworms that are included here. Those are for fiber optic communication among computers. So some of the computers that we see will have these high-speed networking cards for fiber optic cables built into them. That's a higher speed way to communicate information among servers. Okay, so there's really one other thing I wanted to show you, and that's that server hardware tends to be a little noisier. And that is because these machines are designed to evacuate heat very, very effectively. Now the noise that you hear when you first power it up is considerably greater than what you get after the machine's been running for a while. That's because when the machine first comes up, it assumes that it should be running those fans full blast. And after a while, the BIOS is able to say, oh no, the CPU is actually an okay temperature, I don't need to freak out a lot. So this is, I'm going to use the 2U as my example box. The 1U one has smaller fans, and smaller fans tend to spin with higher frequency. When a bearing goes out on a 1U fan, it tends to make a very shrill squeak sound. So those can be particularly obnoxious. This one, it turns out, is quite quiet so far, so I was glad for that. All right, so this machine is a 2U PowerEdge 2950, and we're just going to power it up. Not so bad so far?
Like a 747, isn't it?
Yeah. Now imagine, this is a 2U case, and a rack will hold 42U. So we could have 21 of these servers all on the same rack. If you power up all of those at the same time, you get a pretty substantial amount of rack.
So assuming that with the heat, you'd have to have a well-ventilated or air-conditioned room.
That's actually the major purpose for a rack.
Just give them space.
Yeah, the rack would package these machines right on top of each other. This machine is not designed to have a bunch of heat evoked out of the top or the bottom. If you put your hand up front, you'll feel a bit of a draft. And if I just hold a piece of paper in front, it's actually sticking to it. See that? So that's the suction of this machine trying to draw air into the front and probably blow it out the back. But we don't have it in a rack at the moment, so its airflow is probably a little disrupted by that. Now, it says there's a long list of things happening on screen. I'm going to kill the fluorescence for just a moment here. And I should probably close this as well. That's a little better. So I'm just going to point out that there's a whole lot of text flying by on screen, and that text reflects different BIOS systems that are controlling this computer. The first of them is that every computer has a BIOS that controls how the hard drives are to be configured and so on, and that BIOS starts up and allows you to boot. But there are other BIOSes on this machine that are interrupting it, saying, wait, I need to have a turn as well. So in this case, we have a RAID BIOS that is communicating with the motherboard saying, hey, I can present a device you could boot from as well. And we have two different networks, the networks built into the motherboard and the network card that's been added, that are also saying, hey, you might be able to boot from me because I'm a network card. So each of those in series is showing up to say, I am available to boot this computer. I don't think I plugged that in straight. There we are.
Is this your Ubuntu thing?
Yes, this is the machine that Algernon was working on. I think he used the standard password, so we'll see if this works. In this case, we've installed Ubuntu Linux on this machine.
You just guessed his password.
No, I didn't guess his password. No, I guessed it wrong anyway. I thought he'd use the standard proteomics login, but he didn't.
Sun 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is the password. I don't think it's that easy. But in this case, we note that this computer can run an operating system just like you'd slap on your desktop. We could set this machine up with Windows for that matter. In fact, I've just installed Windows 10 this morning on that 1U machine. So, in general, we tend to run operating systems that are designed for clusters when we run them on rack mount servers. So these machines that came to us came with FreeBSD installed, which is a type of Unix. So, as you can see, it's calmed down a little bit, but it's still producing some amount of noise. And anytime we work with server hardware, expecting a little noise and a little heat and maybe a breeze, if things are going well, is appropriate.
I was speaking to Gerald today, and he's apparently getting a couple of these for his work.
He's got a build cluster, yeah.
Yeah, he made a point that you can't basically put 6 of these together and plug them into a normal PowerPoint, right? Just
well, the maximum amount of power that this machine could use is quite great. right? This had 750 watt power supplies. So if you pack this thing full of high-speed hard drives and had all the CPU cores going full blast and loaded it with a maximum amount of RAM, the draw on the power supply and thus on the AC line would be quite high. So yes, you're not going to plug a full rack of these machines into a single power outlet.
So you do need, when you get a few of them, you need specialized, proper data.
Yeah, basically you need to know what your amperage is.
Yeah.
If you're and you can't judge what your amperage should be when those machines are just sitting quietly. You have to judge what the amperage is at maximum load. And having power circuits that are capable of letting you draw 2 amps or whatever becomes necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Good questions. All right, anything else you'd like to know about server hardware?
I have a general question. What sort of, like you said before, when people go to buy a computer, they look at gigahertz and RAM, but
Yeah.
what, I guess it depends what you're doing, but can you briefly, what would use more RAM compared to processor stuff?
Okay. So let me imagine that I am working in genomics, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If I am doing assembly of whole genome shotgun sequence for a eukaryote, I'm going to have a very, very great need for memory. A machine with 64 gigs of RAM is probably my starting point, frankly. Something like that, if you have too small an amount of memory, and a lot of machines, for example, top out at 32 gigs of RAM. If you attempt to do a job that needs 128 gigs of RAM and 64 or 32 gigs of RAM, you're not going to get very far.
Yeah.
So the type of computing challenge matters a lot. In proteomics, we do a lot of stuff that's processor core intensive, but which doesn't require a huge amount of memory. So we can get by with machines with just 4 gigs of RAM, and almost all of these have that.
Yeah. So I've noticed like NCBI glass, like if you do it on your computer, it's high CPU, but RAM's not so.
That's right. Well,
I guess it's processing to do sequence alignments.
Yes.
But it's not remembering a whole lot of
Well, it doesn't need to. Yeah, it just needs to know what's the distribution of scores, etc.
Whereas assemblies and stuff, it's made all these schemas and it needs them all freely, readily accessible, right? And
Right.
that's what all the RAM is. It's all just sitting there. Sorry, mobile camera. Because I've heard graphic programs need a lot of RAM too. Is that right?
Do you mean graph processing, or do you mean, or do you mean?
Graphic design or anything like that?
Not so much.
Not really.
No, when I capture a high resolution image on my mirrorless Canon, the images are about 25 megs of RAM. It's not bad.
Okay.
If you're dealing with video, you're going to be doing a fair amount of processing. So these videos are being captured in 1080p on that camera. I copy that onto my computer and I use a software called FFmpeg to create what's called an H.264 stream from that, and I post that to YouTube. So that takes, let's say, about real time. So if I talk for 50 minutes, my computer's going to be spending 50 minutes on processing. Yeah. And I think I probably talked longer than that today.
Yeah, no, there's the movies in, what is it, times 265H.
H.264 like or H.265, yeah.
26, I think it's quite a new one.
That's 265.
And I can't even run it on an old laptop. It's very freezy, and even with the same software, but put it on a newer laptop, it runs fine.
Yeah.
It's something time.
A lot of them do 2 passes on
So
the
what's
video.
times 264? That runs alright, but then the 265, it's that HMV or something.
Yeah.
It's a new thing, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, Google has put together some pretty cool codecs for that purpose.
Mm. And that's just, process is not strong enough, would you say?
Generally speaking, that would be the most likely cause.
Mm.
Yeah, but some of those use a fair bit of RAM too. The H.264 encoder I use is pretty light, so not a problem.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for coming, and we'll
That's good,
go ahead and get this posted. Thank you.